My name is T. Ames. I'm the intimacy consultant for the 2024-2025 Voyages season here at Live Arts. And I'm excited to talk to you today about intimacy and intimacy coordination for your show. All right, so just to begin and let you know, I do have some notes on this side. So if you see me looking over here, just because I'm looking at my notes, that's it. The most important thing about this video in this moment, just to kind of give you an introductory course on what intimacy is, why we think it's important, and the sort of base practices that we use whenever we're talking about intimacy in theatrical spaces. All right, so to start off, all of my education is coming from theatrical intimacy education here in the U.S. The wonderful Laura Reichard, who actually did a lot of work here at Live Arts, is one of the co-founders of TIE. So a lot of what I'm talking about is from training from TIE, but also my own personal experiences within intimacy in theatrical spaces. All right, so let's start with the idea of what is intimacy. To start off, honestly, intimacy can be anything, okay? It's not just a sex scene during a show. Intimacy could be a hug, it could be a kiss, it could be holding hands, it could be two actors standing next to each other saying nothing. It's whatever the actors and the director decides could be something intimate. Anything could use coordination, anything could use choreography. Something as simple as a wave could even have some intimacy choreography. So truly, it is up to the director and it's up to the actors, their comfortability levels, and what they need for the show to actually happen. To continue forward, it's important for y'all to know that I am not a social worker or a psychologist. So what I'm talking to you about today is all based out of what we call trauma-conscious or safety-informed practices. I am not a trauma-informed counselor of any sort because I don't have a degree in any of this. Okay, so what I'm talking to you about is how we relate when it comes to intimacy. It is not my responsibility of what happens in that room. And by that, I mean, I don't have a degree in being responsible for any of the things happening, okay? So what I'm telling you are things that I've learned, okay? And if these things don't fully work for you, we can always talk about it. Feel free to contact me through Live Arts and we can figure this out, okay? I promise it's gonna be fine. Okay. This idea of acting comes from the Latin word accio, which means to do, right? So as actors, what we're doing is acting, right? We're doing things on stage in a theatrical fashion and people are coming and watching us do the cool stuff. Or as TIE might say, do the hard stuff, okay? The reason that we call it the hard stuff is because theater is it's more than just comfort, right? We are in a business of telling the most uncomfortable stories possible. And part of telling those uncomfortable stories is finding the best ways to do that safely, okay? So a lot of intimacy coordination and a lot of what I do is about teaching people how to make safer choices to tell the uncomfortable stories. Really important that we know that in the business of intimacy coordination, we are trying our hardest not to work from a place of survival. Meaning, we want to make sure that everyone in the room, whether they're a director, an actor, a stage manager, a designer, does not matter who, that they feel confident enough to speak and act from a place of understanding and accepting the risk in the room. We'll talk more about what that means in a little bit. But if we're operating out of a place of survival, so like fight, flight, or freeze, if we're working out of a place like that, that means that we're not fully able to have consensual practices in the room. Because honestly, our bodies don't know the differences between acting and real life. So if a character is having a really hard time, so for example, maybe a character is having a panic attack on stage, that could use intimacy coordination or choreography. So your body as an actor does not know the difference between I'm an actor doing some sort of choreography like a panic attack and I'm a human being outside of a theater having a panic attack. So part of intimacy is also teaching yourself and your body the differences between what's real and what's not. And so it helps to keep all those lines and those boundaries incredibly clear and consensual. Let's talk about consent, okay? Consent has been this big topic that we've been talking about for at least a few decades here in theater, and I'm so grateful that we are having these conversations. In intimacy coordination and choreography, it's really important to talk about consent because we can't do anything without someone's consent, or we shouldn't do anything without someone's consent. So within an intimacy context, in a theatrical intimacy context, what's really important about consent is that consent is conditional, contextual, and revocable, meaning that at any point you are allowed to say yes or no to anything. What can get complicated about this conversation is that you have a lot of directors who say, well, I want my actor to do this piece of choreography. I want to block my scene this way. If my actor says no, what do I do? Great question. You talk about it. You figure out what those actors' boundaries are. You figure out what that director's boundaries are, and you work from there. And we'll talk more about boundaries coming up. But for right now, let's stick with consent. Okay? So if consent is conditional, contextual, and revocable, but that means that at any point someone can say yes or no. They don't have to give justification for that yes or no. They just have to be able to fully verbalize or physicalize that yes or no. I say physicalize because you have some actors who are not verbal, right? Or choose not to be verbal, and that's okay. We want everyone and we want all these practices to be accessible. When it comes to this idea of consent, it should be fully informed and verbal or nonverbal. When I say fully informed, I mean that your actor and your director and all the people in that theatrical space where you are rehearsing and performing should know what their rights are in that space. So when it comes to live arts, our volunteer handbook is a great place to start. Okay? And if you have any questions, please ask your director, please ask a live arts staff member, because it's important that we continue these conversations. Because again, we want to operate from a place of understanding and being grounded in that understanding. Don't want to work from a place of survival, because that fight, flight, or freeze takes over, and then suddenly we can't do anything else because your body cannot tell the difference between acting and real life. When it also comes to consent, we have this awesome thing called a self-care cue. And by that, I mean any sort of word to help a director or an actor or anybody else in that space know what's important and how to say if they need something in that space. Okay? So, for example, one of our favorite self-care cues is the word button. Just a button. We've seen other versions of self-care cues. I've been in shows where button is a word in the show, so instead we use a random word like watermelon or umbrella, whatever it might be. It just needs to be decided between the director and the actors and the rest of the crew, so everyone knows what it is. Why is something like a self-care cue important? It gives your actors and your other people in that space power to revoke consent. And again, that consent doesn't necessarily have to be, no, I don't want to do this. It could be, button, I need to use the bathroom. Or, button, I need to drink water. It also could be, button, can I speak to the director for 5 minutes? I want to chat about something. You don't have to say what it is, but all we know is that whenever that self-care cue is used, it's serious. It means that everyone is pausing in the room. And then it's the director's responsibility, or whoever has power in that room, to look at that actor or that other crew member and say, what do you need? What's going on? Let's talk about it. That could be a public or a private conversation. Again, it's up to whoever called button. We use button a lot in education because it's really easy to teach children how to use a word and say this word and we know that you need our attention. It can be a little harder to do that with adults sometimes because we've learned a lot. We've had a lot of experiences, so it's hard to kind of rework our brains. But that's why we continue educating ourselves so that we can use these sort of cues and different phrases and different ways of thinking and talking about theater and grow from there. Self-care cues are super important. Anyone can use them. It could be, I need to revoke consent in this moment for whatever reason. It could just be, I need a break. It could be anything that you need a self-care cue for. When it comes to talking about consent, we need to make sure that we are using what we call a consensual or an affirmative or enthusiastic yes. I work with a lot of kids in education who might be nonverbal. So sometimes their enthusiastic yes looks like, right? Or it could be whatever we decide is their yes. But for folks who are verbal, who can use verbal consent, enthusiastic yes is yes, right? Or yeah, or I'm good. It's whatever it's been decided upon in that room, in that space, with the people in that space is considered a yes, okay? And anything that is not enthusiastic, anything that is not consensual or affirmative yes is a no. Anything. The basis of consent is really about whatever that person in the room whose consent we're talking about, if they are able to physically, mentally, or emotionally do something, that means that we have their consent in that area. And if it's something that they don't feel like they can consent to, that means that that's a boundary of theirs. So let's talk about boundaries. The first conversation we have to have when it comes to boundaries is talking about this idea of a safe space. Why did I put safe space in quotation marks? Honestly, theater is really not about safe spaces because it's really hard to guarantee a safe space in theater. Why is that? Because again, theater is not about comfort. I think often in theater, we talk about safe in the same context as comfortable, right? That's not actually the case when we're using those words in the same context. What we're actually saying is we are looking to be in a space where everyone accepts what might happen in this space because we all are basing our practices in consent and respecting and caring about each other's boundaries and using things like our self-care cues. So, instead of using safe space, we started shifting our language in the theatrical world to space of acceptable risk, or SOAR. SOAR is important because it takes into context and into the conversation that we all are respecting where we're coming from. And because this is theater, and theater is about telling the uncomfortable stories that we all need to hear because we're helping to uplift communities and tell stories that are important to talk about and important to embrace, right? The idea of accepting risk in a space just means when you walk into this room, as long as your boundaries are being respected, as long as consent is a major factor and that we understand and respect your no and your enthusiastic yes, we all can do a lot. And if you feel like that risk is too great for you in that moment, it is always your right to say, button, and to use my self-care cue, whatever that might mean. And again, button doesn't necessarily have to be this big, intense thing. So if you feel like the risk in that room is, I have not used the bathroom in 2 hours and I need to go right now, that's part of the risk that you've accepted. Because we usually work through and go to breaks, right? But if you feel like you can't wait until a break, that's part of the acceptable risk in that space. So you would use your self-care cue and say, button, I need to go to the bathroom. Everyone pauses. We take a second. We do what we got to do. And then we come back to that same space of acceptable risk because everyone's on the same page about what that acceptable risk is. In order to accept risk in a theatrical space, we need boundaries. Really good boundaries. Okay, so within this idea of SOAR, or space of acceptable risk, we would have ways of making that easier for our directors, our actors, and other theater makers in that space. Okay? So for example, a stage manager can have a stage manager's kit, right? Or cart at Live Arts usually. That's got all these things on it for you whenever you might need them. So snacks, first aid, water, parking passes, whatever it might be. That helps that stage manager within that space of acceptable risk so that they can be prepared for whatever they might need. For actors, we have sometimes an actor's toolbox or our scripts or highlighters or whatever else helps us to really hone in on that space of acceptable risk, right? For actors as well, we have boundaries. Everyone's got boundaries, but in this conversation, it's most important to talk about the actors because they're the ones who are accepting most of that risk as the ones who are on stage. Intimacy can be anything, right? So part of that means that the power dynamic within a theatrical space between a director and an actor or an actor and a stage manager, whatever that might be, means that we all need tools to be able to navigate those relationships, to navigate those moments, okay? So boundaries help us to navigate that in the healthiest way possible when it comes to intimacy. Everything in theater has boundaries. Everything, right? Lights, costumes, sets, props, everything has a boundary. And by that, I mean we have budgets, we have materials that we can use, we've got all these things that would keep actors or other crew members within that theatrical space within certain boundaries. The important thing about boundaries is that it helps us to accept that risk because we know that we've got tools in place to help us. One of my favorite things about boundaries, there was an amazing study done about small kids, I believe they were preschoolers or kindergartners, who went on a field trip with their teacher. And when they're on this field trip, they had two different fields that they were visiting out in the country. One field was nice and open, rolling hills, gorgeous. The kids got so scared that they stayed by their teacher the entire time on the trip. Again, open space, no fences, nothing. Just rolling hills, and the kids would not leave their teacher's side. But then they went to another field, and this field had a fenced-in perimeter. As soon as the kids saw the fence, they took off running. Why? Because there were boundaries set in place. They could accept that risk for themselves of, oh, I know I can go that far. And they felt comfortable and confident enough to just take off. And their teacher felt confident and comfortable enough to let them take off because they had those boundaries. So our boundaries work the exact same way as the kids in that study, right? If we have boundaries, that means that is the space of acceptable risk that we personally are allowing ourselves to have in that moment or to go in that moment. Boundaries, at the end of the day, are not about limitations. Boundaries are the space where we can really create, and boundaries can help us create the beautiful theater that we all know and love because of respecting where each other is coming from. When we're talking about boundaries, we're going to do something called a boundary check, okay? Because sometimes we can sit here and talk about boundaries, but it's hard to really relate or even define what those are without some sort of person leading that way, right? Or leading that conversation. So boundary check is a very simple way of deciding in that moment what your boundaries might be in a theatrical space. And again, I think everyone could check their boundaries, whether they're an actor or a director or a crew member, it doesn't matter. But usually we use boundary checks for actors. And usually we only really use them when we're talking about intimacy or when we're choreographing intimacy. You could do this every day if you want. You can do this when you're just working on intimacy. I like to just keep it as a refresher and to normalize the practice because if it's not considered normal, then no one's going to want to do it. So if we normalize the idea of intimacy and boundaries and why it's important to have boundaries, to accept that risk in the space, the easier it's going to be to do it. Boundary checks are like tuning instruments, right? And that instrument is your body, okay? So it is very possible to have emotional and mental boundaries. We all do. In theater, when it comes to choreographing intimacy, those conversations can be important depending on the actor, depending on the director. In this context, we're only going to be talking about physical boundaries because that's the one that we encounter more in the theatrical space. So when we talk about boundary checks and them being more physical rather than mental or emotional, what we really are talking about is learning how to talk about how to touch each other. Say that one more time. Boundary checks are really about learning how to talk about how to touch each other. And I know, depending on the group, that sounds incredibly weird, okay? But again, intimacy is really about those physical moments between actors or between directors or between stage managers in a theatrical space. And because a lot of those boundaries are going to be more physical rather than mental or emotional in theatrical space, really what we're talking about is this, right? Our bodies, our physical instruments that we use to tell stories. So, I know it sounds a little weird to start off, but the idea of learning how to talk about how we touch one another is just about learning how to respect our bodies, both our own personal bodies and the bodies of the people around us. So really, a boundary check is an actor or a theater maker, let's just say that generally, a theater maker, deciding where they are okay with being touched. So boundary checks help us with all the yeses physically, but also all the nos. So what we're about to talk about is how do you boundary check? And again, if you have any questions about this after I explain it, I am more than welcome to help explain it to your cast and crew. Okay? Just contact Live Art staff and I'll make sure that we have that conversation either virtually or in person. Let's start the check. Boundary checks usually happen in groups of two. Okay, so you have person A and person B. I'll have person A over here and person B over here. Okay? Person A and person B will stand back to back. So, back to back, right? Person A will start. And here's the basics of a boundary check. We start off with a scan. Then we show what we just scanned. We guide the other person to show them what we were just talking about. And then we tell each other what we just did. And then we repeat it. So, we're scanning, we're showing, we're guiding, we're telling, and we repeat. So, person A, person B, staying back to back. Person A while they're facing away from person B, decides in that moment where they are okay with being touched. Okay? So whenever I do a boundary check and I'm the one checking my boundaries, I say, okay, where am I okay with being touched in this moment? I usually close my eyes and then I do what I call a scan. I start physically on the top of my head and I decide, going head to toe, where I am okay with being touched. So I'll give an example. I normally don't like being touched in my hair. I normally don't like being touched in my chest area or anywhere here. So when I'm scanning, I will say, I don't want to be touched here, so I will actively move over that section of my body. I'm okay with my face being touched today. That's okay. I'm okay with my shoulders and my arms being touched. That works too. I'm okay with this. And you just go head to toe and decide in that moment where you are okay with being touched. Once you've done your scan, then person A and person B will face one another. Person A will then look at person B and show them what their boundaries are. So what they just did back to back, they'll do facing each other. So person A will look at person B and they'll say, you might not even say it, just depends on your comfortability level. They could just show where their boundaries are, or they could tell the person, or they could do both, right? They could say, I am okay with being touched here, not here though, okay? I am okay with being touched here, not here, whatever those boundaries are. It's person B's job just to listen, just to watch, just to be present in that moment for person A. So after person A has then showed person B what their boundaries are, where they are okay with being touched, then person B will just repeat what they just heard to person A. Make sense? So I kind of skipped over guide because sometimes people don't like the guide option, but guide simply means that person A can use person B's hand and they can put their hand over person A's hand to then scan their body so that person B gets more of a physical idea of what person A is talking about. Now again, sometimes person B is not comfortable with that, and that's totally fine. Whenever I work with education, so minors, we usually don't do guide. We just do tell. It's easier for person A to tell person B what their boundaries are, rather than person B physically touching person A or being close to a hover over person A's body to tell them what they are okay with and what their boundaries are. So after you do that, then person B just repeats what they just heard to person A. So if I'm person A and I just said, I am not okay with my hair being touched, but I'm okay here, I'm okay here. If I'm person B, I say, okay, as person A, you're not okay with your head being touched today, but you are okay with having your arms touched. You are okay with this. You're not okay with this, whatever it might be, okay? And then once person B is done telling person A what they just heard their boundaries are, person B just looks at person A and says, did I miss anything? And if they did, person A just says, yeah, you missed X, Y, and Z. And if they didn't, person A goes, nope, you're good. And then you've just successfully completed part 1 of your boundary check. Part 2 is just the same thing, but person B is leading. So when you're standing back to back, person B will then decide. They'll do their personal scan and say, where am I okay with being touched today, head to toe? After that, person B, person A will face each other. Person B will then show person A what their boundaries are. Person A will repeat to person B what they just heard. Person A will look at person B and say, did I miss anything? And then person B says, yeah, you missed X, Y, and Z. Or, nope, you're good. And then you officially completed both steps of your boundary check. Again, boundaries can be super weird the first couple times that you're checking them because we're not used to really checking in with our bodies in that way. And it can be kind of hard sometimes to really show that to somebody else. But the whole point of doing a boundary check is really showing within that space of acceptable risk, here's what I am okay with and here's what I'm not okay with. It puts everyone on the same page. We're going to have moments when we're doing boundary checks where your boundaries might change. So for example, if you're in a really heated scene and person A and person B are scene partners and they're really in it and they're really present, and maybe, let's say person A had a boundary on their shoulder, person B goes to touch their shoulder and then remembers, oh, they had a boundary on their shoulder. And then they can say, button, hey, person A, I remember you had a boundary on your shoulder. Is that okay in this moment? Is that still a boundary for you? How are you feeling about your shoulder being touched in this moment? And then person A can say, actually, yeah, I really like that choice. Let's go ahead and do it. Or, no, it's still a boundary for me. And then person B can adjust. Or sometimes it happens the exact opposite way. Person A and person B are in a really great scene, very intense, very present. And then person A has a moment of, I would really like for them to touch my shoulder in this moment. I think it would really help move the scene along. So then they can say, hey, button, I know that I had a boundary here, or something else we would call that as a fence. I had a fence here. But in this moment, I feel like that's okay. I'm okay with this being touched. So that fence has what we would call a gate, right? So your boundaries are where your fences are, where your perimeters are. And then sometimes it's possible for those fences to have gates, because gates can be opened, but only if you open them. Now, when all this is happening, the director does have some say. But again, it is not up to the director to go against an actor's boundaries. So if a director wants to make a choice, they can say button or hold or pause, whatever works for them. And they can say, hey, person A, I know that you had a boundary here. I know you had a fence on your shoulder. I would really like to try a moment where we have person B touch your shoulder. How do you feel about that? What are your thoughts? And notice I'm trying my best to use open-ended questions, right? I'm saying, how do you feel about this? Are you open to this? What are your thoughts about this? Because that gives the person you're asking a lot of free range to answer it in a way that actually feels truthful for them. Because I think a lot of times we get stuck in yes or no questions. And because we're in a space of acceptable risk, and you've got a power dynamic here between actors and directors or actors and stage managers, sometimes actors just don't feel like they have the power to say no in moments. So part of why we talk about this, part of why we have boundary checks, is so an actor feels empowered to say no, feels empowered to be real about what they're feeling, about, you know what, I'm open to that. Let's talk about that. And why this might have been offense. Not because the actor has to justify it, but because maybe that actor wants to talk about, here's why I am okay with that in this moment. But other than that, it's offense. Okay? And maybe it is a no. Maybe the director asks, hey, can we try someone touching you here? How do you feel about that? And the actor says, I don't feel good about that. No, that's not something that I want. It's the director's job to go, okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Let's try something else, right? Let's find a compromise. Because again, theater is about telling stories. And telling those stories does not always mean that we're going to line up on one idea of how to do that. Most of the time, it doesn't work that way because we all come in with different ways of life and different experiences. That's the beauty of doing what we do, right? So intimacy takes all of that into account and makes sure that everyone has a voice. And that voice is sometimes verbal, sometimes nonverbal, right? So if you're asking an actor who is nonverbal how they feel about something, right? It could be here, are we good? And if they give a thumbs up, great, let's try it. And if they say no, or just or whatever that might be, that's a no. We respect the no. Again, consent is revocable. It's conditional. It's contextual. It can be a no sometimes. And we ask that everyone in that space accept that no and then move forward. We don't want to fight about people's boundaries. We don't want to question people's boundaries. We don't want actors or directors or stage managers to feel like they have to justify their boundaries. They shouldn't have to. That's why these conversations are so important, because it gives all of us an opportunity to really talk about, why is it important to have consent? Why is it important to have boundaries? Why is it important to have a self-care cue like button? Why is it important to have conversations about spaces of acceptable risk, and why that risk is so important in that moment, and why we all want to be here and tell the stories and take and accept that risk to tell those stories. We talk about intimacy in this way because it finally is giving us a way to have the hard discussions about our bodies, about how we're feeling, about our perspective in the world. It gives that opportunity for the yes or the no to be respected, to be celebrated, and it helps us to tell the stories we want to tell in the best ways possible. I really appreciate y'all being here with me today. I know this was long, but we did it. I'm so proud of us. I'm so proud of you. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Please reach out to your director. Please reach out to LiveArt staff. They can get in contact with me and we can have more conversations about this. I'm so grateful that we had this time. Thank you so much.